She clutched the blood-soaked bandage tighter against her side as another gust of freezing wind slammed against the barn walls. The candle had gone out hours ago, and the wolves were getting closer, howling in the dark beyond the wooden slats. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, pain slicing through every inhale. They'd left her here to die, alone, forgotten, a nurse with nothing left but a shattered body and a ghost of hope. But then, the barn door creaked open. At first, she thought it was death coming for her. Tall, silent, wrapped in shadows. But as the stranger stepped into the moonlight, she saw the war paint, the feathers, the piercing dark eyes. A Cheyenne warrior. He didn't speak. He only knelt beside her, gently lifting the torn blanket, inspecting her wound with the calm precision of someone who'd seen too much pain, and still chose to heal. She tried to ask why. Why save her? A white woman, an enemy to his people. But all he did was place a hand over hers and whisper in a language she didn't understand, yet somehow it made her feel safe. Before we jump back and unravel how a wounded widow nurse ended up in a warrior's, Kare, introduce yourself in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. The wind carried dust like whispers, scattering it across the cracked wooden planks of the main street, in Dry Creek. It wasn't a big town, not even a proper one by some standards, but it had a church, a saloon, and enough judgment to go around for 100 souls. The buildings leaned with age, and the weight of stories no one dared to say, out loud. And walking among them every morning at dawn was a woman wrapped in silence, Mary Whelan. She wasn't old, barely 30, some said, but the war had aged her, not in the way it does a man with lines and scars and hardened eyes. Her aging was quieter, in her limp, in the dark gloves she wore even in the heat, in the way her eyes never really focused on anyone's face for too long. Folks said she was cursed, not cursed like witches or hexes, cursed in that way women are when they've lost too much and lived through what should have killed them. She'd been a nurse, they all knew that, married to a Union soldier who never came home. She came back from the battlefield with blood on her hands and a hollow in her heart, and something else that made people stop looking her in the eye. No one really knew what happened out there. Some whispered she'd gone deaf from a blast that killed 3 soldiers and left her screaming for hours in the mud. Others claimed it wasn't the war at all, that something had broken in her when they brought her husband's body back without his face. No one asked, and Mary never told. The children didn't speak to her. Their mothers warned them not to. She walked through town like a ghost in daylight, the hem of her long black dress brushing the dirt. Every footstep echoed without echo, for Mary couldn't hear the way her boots clicked against the ground. She watched lips more than eyes, and when someone dared speak to her, she answered with a nod or a slow, unsure word, uncertain of how it sounded. In the evenings she sat by her window and stitched cloth by candlelight. Some of the women brought her work, hemming sleeves, patching pants, always dropped off at her doorstep, never handed over directly. She'd find them wrapped in silence. Like everything else in her life, she had no friends, only whispers. She's not right in the head. She talks to herself, did you see that? I heard she watched 3 men bleed out and didn't even flinch. But it wasn't madness. In Mary's eyes, it was emptiness, the kind that settles into a soul and makes a home there when no one comes knocking. She lived in a tiny cabin on the edge of town, close to where the fields started turning wild. No husband, no family. Just a faded portrait of a man in blue, a Bible with blood on the cover, and a rusty medical kit she hadn't touched in months. There had been a time she mattered, when her hands were steady, when men called for her in pain and trusted her to stitch them back together. Back then she was strong, respected, maybe even feared a little. Now they looked at her like a broken mirror, something once useful, now dangerous to touch. Sometimes, she lit the lamp in her front room and waited for someone to knock, for anyone to need her again. But the door stayed closed. She still walked to the church on Sundays, even if she couldn't hear the sermon. She sat in the back pew, lips moving silently as she guessed the words to hymns she once knew by heart. No one sat beside her, not even the preacher's wife. It wasn't that they hated her, not exactly. It was worse than that. They pitied her, and pity turns hearts colder than hate ever could. The only time Mary felt something close to peace was when she rode out past the edge of town on her mare Cricket. She couldn't hear the hooves, but she could feel them, each step a thump through her bones. The wind in her hair, the sun on her face. It was the only time the silence didn't feel so heavy. One evening, as the sky turned to rust, she rode, farther than usual, past the Miller farm, past the old creek bed, out toward the hills where no one went anymore. That's when she saw it. Smoke in the distance. Not a big fire, just a single trail, rising up like a question mark. She turned, Cricket toward it. She didn't know it then, but that choice would change everything. The smoke was coming from a barn, half collapsed, hidden between hills, the kind of place forgotten by maps and men alike. The boards groaned in the wind, and something about it made her shiver. Inside, she'd find something that would tear her quiet world wide open. But that part, we'll get to soon enough. Before we dive deeper into Mary's story, just a quick note. I'm Thomas, the voice behind this narration. If you enjoy how it sounds, let me know in the comments so we can keep the same voice in future videos. Because this isn't just a tale of survival. It's a story of healing, of unexpected kindness, and of a warrior who saw beyond the silence and chose to protect what the world had cast aside. And it starts right here, at the edge of the wild. Mary didn't plan to return to the barn. After that first evening, when she found nothing inside but charred hay and an old iron kettle still warm from fire, she told herself it was just a squatter's den, or maybe the hiding place of a runaway. Someone would come back for it eventually. She had no reason to go again. But the next morning, she woke with a pull in her chest, soft, persistent, like a string wrapped around her ribs, tugging her back toward the hills. She told herself it was curiosity. Nothing more. When she arrived again, the smoke was gone. The barn looked empty. Still, she tied Cricket near the fence and stepped inside. He was waiting this time. She saw only the outline at first, tall, broad shoulders, unmoving. He didn't flinch when she entered, didn't step into the light. Just stood there, as if he'd been waiting, as if he knew she'd come back. Her breath caught, and her body tensed. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The war paint on his face had faded, smudged by wind and sleep, but it still gave him the look of something ancient, dangerous and proud. His long black hair was braided tightly behind him, and his dark eyes studied her without fear, without pity. A Cheyenne warrior. Mary didn't move. Her mind flooded with what the town would say if they knew. What they'd do if they saw her standing there with him. He didn't raise a weapon. Didn't speak. Just looked at her. She touched her chest lightly, then pointed to him. He tilted, his head curious. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and tapped his ear. Her eyes widened. He knew. Somehow, he understood. That night, they said nothing more. She left him a small sack of bread and dried venison, then mounted her horse and rode back before darkness fell. She didn't tell anyone. Who would she tell? The next day, she returned again, and again after that. Each time, the silence grew more familiar, less empty. She learned his name through gesture and repetition. Ta-Senan, though she couldn't say it quite right. He never laughed when she tried, only smiled, just a little. She brought him herbs, bandages, and old cloth. She didn't ask what he was running from. She could see it in the way he watched the trees, the way he tensed at distant sounds. Once he lifted his shirt to reveal a jagged wound across his ribs, stitched clumsily, half-healed. Mary knelt without hesitation, cleaning it with the same steady hands she used to have in field tents soaked with blood. She didn't need words. When she finished wrapping him, he surprised her, reaching out, touching the frayed end of her scarf where it hid a scar on her neck. She froze, then met his gaze. He didn't ask what happened. He only nodded once as if to say, "I see you." Word traveled fast in Dry Creek, even faster when truth was scarce and suspicion was ripe. "Mary's been riding out past the creek every morning," the blacksmith's wife said. "Alone." "She's up to something," muttered the preacher's boy, who'd followed her once and returned pale-faced. "I saw her near the old barn. She wasn't alone." The sheriff didn't act at first. Not officially, but men began watching her more closely when she rode into town. Eyes followed her when she bought supplies. The storekeeper shorted her on sugar. The preacher's wife stopped delivering sewing orders. Mary felt it. In the way doors didn't open as she passed. In the sudden silence that followed her, she didn't stop visiting the barn, but she started carrying a knife again. One afternoon, a storm rolled over the hills, sudden and violent. Thunder cracked open the sky and rain came down in sheets. She found Tassanan kneeling outside the barn, face to the wind. When he turned, his hair was soaked, his face streaked with mud. He looked like a man standing against the world itself. Mary didn't speak. She simply walked to him, took his hand, and led him inside. There, they sat near the small fire he had managed to keep alive. She dried his face with a rag and laid a blanket across his shoulders. He watched her as if memorizing every movement, as if she were something fragile and rare. Finally, he broke the silence, a single word. "Why?" She blinked. Then slowly, she tapped her own heart. Held up a shaking hand. She wasn't sure he would understand, but Tassanan did. He reached into the satchel at his side and pulled out a small pouch. From it, he poured dried sage and sweetgrass into her palm. Then he added a smooth, flat stone, etched with a symbol. She looked at him. He pointed, to the stone, then to her, strength. That night, as the wind howled and the fire crackled between them, Mary felt something shift, not just in the air, in herself. She didn't feel hollow. She felt seen. But peace, like smoke, never stays long in a place like Dry Creek. 3 days later, while Mary stood in the general store, the sheriff stepped in with 2 deputies. He didn't speak to her. He only looked at the list in her hand, then at the supplies, too many for one woman. He nodded to the bags of jerky. "Expecting company, Miss Whelan?" She didn't answer. Didn't have to. The deputy stepped forward and grabbed, the sack. "You feeding someone out there?" She stood straighter. Her chin rose, but her heart thundered. They didn't expect her to speak. They expected her to break. Instead, she met their eyes, lips pressed tight. The sheriff leaned in. "We heard. There's an Indian hiding in the hills. You wouldn't be helping a fugitive now, would you?" She didn't blink, but when she returned to the barn that evening, she wasn't alone. 3 riders followed her, hidden in the brush, waiting. She didn't lead them to the barn. She circled wide, doubled back, waited until they gave up. Then, breathless, she crept through the rain and warned Tassanan. He didn't panic. He simply nodded, his jaw tightening. He packed his few belongings, his pouch, the herbs, the stone he'd given her. When he turned to leave, Mary grabbed his hand. She didn't want to lose him. Not yet. He looked back at her, then placed a hand over her heart. Then he pointed toward the rising sun. "I will return." And he was gone. But trouble had already taken root. And someone had seen her. The town would soon decide whether Mary Whelan was just a strange widow or a traitor. And when fire and hatred come knocking on her door, it will be the same hands that once healed soldiers on the battlefield that must now fight to protect a man the world calls an enemy. Because sometimes, love begins not with words, but with silence strong enough to stand against the storm. It started with a knock. Not the gentle kind. This was sharp, fast, and repeated. Mary looked up from the hearth where she was steeping pine bark for tea. Her hands stilled. The second knock wasn't a knock at all. It was a fist. Then another. Then the sound of boots on wood. They weren't waiting. The front door burst inward with a crack. Two men, one with a badge and another with a rifle. Behind them, more shadows crowded her porch. Mary stumbled backward, the hot kettle tipping over and scalding the floor. "Mary Whelan," the sheriff said, not unkindly but without softness. "We've got reason to believe you're harboring a fugitive, a hostile." Mary couldn't hear his words, but she saw the motion of his lips. Fugitive. Hostile. Danger. She shook her head, tried to speak, but her voice caught somewhere between her throat and fear. "You're gonna come with us." She resisted when they grabbed her arm, so they made it rough. They locked her in the old feed house behind the sheriff's office. No bars, just thick wood and one small window high up on the wall. It smelled of dried oats and rust. There was no fire and her coat had been torn in the struggle. Snow began to fall by nightfall, drifting in through the cracks. She sat against the far wall, shaking, less from cold, more from rage. They hadn't found Tassanan, but they didn't need to. They had her. The preacher's wife had seen the stone. The one he gave her. It had fallen from her pocket at church, passed around like evidence at a hanging. Proof, they said. Proof she was helping a savage. Mary closed her eyes. The whispers in town had always been cruel, but now they were loud, righteous, sharpened like knives. She imagined the children staring, the preacher's voice ringing out from the pulpit, the storekeeper locking his doors as she passed. They wanted a villain. She had given them one, and what hurt most wasn't the accusations. It was how quickly they stopped seeing her as human. The cold seeped deeper. By midnight, her fingers had gone numb, her lips cracked. Her body trembled in long, violent shivers. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind folding into old memories of battlefield, tense, screams in the dark, her husband's broken body, her last breath before the deafness claimed her. She thought she might die this time. Maybe she should. But somewhere between dream and frostbite, the door creaked open, and there he was. Tassanan. No gun. No war paint. No vengeance. Just a blanket, in his arms and eyes full of something deeper than fear. He knelt beside her without a word and wrapped her in the blanket, rubbing her arms to bring warmth back. He pulled another bundle from his coat, boiled roots and broth wrapped in hide. He held it to her lips gently, like she was made of glass. She tried to speak. Her voice cracked. Nothing came. He didn't ask her to. He just stayed. And in that silence, something broke open, not in her but around her, the walls of anger, the shell of distrust. Because he hadn't come to rescue her like a hero. He came to stay. They didn't flee immediately. They waited until dawn, when the town still slept, and the snow had muffled every footstep. He helped her onto Cricket, then walked beside the horse through the woods, leading her with careful steps. They didn't speak. There was no need. She watched the way he moved, aware of every sound, every branch. She saw how he checked her hands, tucked the blanket tighter when she shivered. It wasn't affection he showed her. It was respect. They reached the high ridge by noon. There, in a hidden clearing beneath a canopy of pine, stood a simple shelter. Logs leaned into each other, smoke rising from a small fire pit. Inside, there, were herbs drying, hides stretched to cure, and a carved wooden bowl filled with clean snow. She stared at it all, then turned to him. Why? He met her gaze and tapped his chest. Then he pointed to her. You stayed. Now I stay. Over the next few days, her strength returned. So did her voice, though she spoke little. He taught her a few words of his language, slow and careful. She showed him how to crush willow bark for pain. He mended her torn coat with sinew. She mended the wound on his side again. It had split open during the climb. Their bond didn't grow through grand moments. It grew in the small ones. Him watching over her as she slept. Her catching him carving the stone symbol again, leaving it at her bedside. A glance, a gesture, a silence shared without fear, and trust. Real, hard-earned trust began to bloom in that quiet, snow-covered clearing. But the storm hadn't passed. Down in Dry Creek, the sheriff nursed bruised pride. The preacher called for action, and a group of men, rifles slung over shoulders and righteousness burning in their chests, prepared to ride. They wanted blood, and Mary Whelan, once invisible, now stood at the center of something much larger than herself. But this time, she wouldn't be alone, because when the fire came again, it wouldn't just be rage that answered it. It would be love, steady, silent, unbreakable. The winter lingered long into spring that year. Snow melted slow across the high ridge, revealing new earth, dark and damp, eager for life. Wildflowers curled up from beneath the frostbitten grass. Streams thawed and hummed again. And in that hidden clearing, Mary and Tasinan worked in quiet rhythm. They built with their hands. No plans, no blueprints, just trust. The shelter grew, log by log, into a small cabin. She sewed hides to line the walls while he shaped stone and wood into tools. He taught her how to listen to the trees, how to track elk without leaving a footprint. She showed him how to stitch with finer thread, how to treat a fever before it takes root. And on one early morning, with mist curling low over the hill, he led her to a patch of cleared land beyond the ridge. There stood a broken corral, old and forgotten. He placed her hand on the gatepost, then tapped his chest. You, then pointed to the fence. Home. A horse ranch, she realized. He wasn't just hiding here. He was dreaming, and he wanted her to dream with him. That night by firelight, he sat beside her as she traced a sketch she had drawn in the dirt. A long stable, wide pastures, a fire pit, between two chairs. A life. He watched her hands, then reached for the small carved stone he kept with him always. This time he pressed it into her palm, not as a gift, but as a vow. She nodded once. Yes. But peace doesn't settle easily on stolen, and past don't stay buried just because you build over them. The first sign came with the smoke, black, thick, rising from the South Valley. Not theirs. Dry Creek. The town hadn't healed in her absence. If anything, it had curdled. Sheriff Whitcomb had been embarrassed before the entire county after Mary escaped. The preacher stoked fear with Sunday, sermons full of fire and hell. And when two cattlemen claimed they saw an Indian savage roaming the upper trails, panic turned into purpose. A posse was forming again. This time they weren't just after her. They were coming to finish what they thought justice had started. She wanted to run, just for a moment, pack what she could, ride far west, disappear again. But when she looked at Tasinan, kneeling by, the fire as he carved fence rails for the new corral, she felt something shift. She wasn't the same woman they had tried to bury. She'd survived pain, survived silence. Now she had something to fight for. They worked through the night, digging trenches near the trail to slow riders, camouflaging the cabin from the southern ridge. Mary retrieved her husband's old revolver from a box beneath the floorboards. She hadn't fired it since the war, but her hands remembered. Tasinan handed her a bow, silent, deadly, respectful of the land. He showed her how to string it with calm precision. They weren't planning to kill. They were planning to stand. But it wasn't the sheriff who came first. It was his past, Tasinan's. Just before dawn, as Mary collected water from the stream, she saw 3 figures emerge from the trees. Tall, dark-haired, bearing the same markings as him. Cheyenne. But these men weren't friends. One wore a bear-tooth necklace, signifying vengeance. Another had a fresh scar still raw across his chest. Warriors. She stepped back, unsure. Tasinan emerged from the cabin, saw them, and froze. Words were exchanged, sharp, low, impossible for Mary to read. One man gestured toward her, then toward the hills, then spat on the ground. The meaning was clear. She had changed him, made him weak. Tasinan didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw his blade. He only stepped between them and Mary. And when they turned to leave, shaking their heads, one gave a final gesture, across the throat. A warning. They would not forget. Mary touched his arm when it was over. "Do you need to go with them?" He looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. He placed her hand on his chest. I choose you. Later that day, as they returned to finishing the corral, her hands trembled. She hadn't spoken it aloud, but the truth rose in her throat like bile. I wasn't always a nurse, she said softly, unsure if he could understand, but needing to say it. Before the war, I did something terrible. Tasinan paused. She stared at her hands. I gave up on someone, my sister. She begged me to stay. I left, and she died of fever. I thought, if I just kept saving others, it would make up for it. He said nothing for a long time. Then gently he placed a pine sprig in her hand, pressed it closed. Forgive, he said slowly, deliberately, then pointed to her heart. She broke down then, quietly, into his shoulder. Because sometimes, forgiveness doesn't need to be earned, it only needs to be offered. That night, the fire burned brighter than usual, not just from flame, but from hope. They finished the corral. They hung a single horseshoe above the door. They sat beside each other beneath a blanket and watched the stars come out one by one. And somewhere in the woods beyond, judgment crept, closer, riding on horses, carrying rifles, dragging their fear like a banner. But Mary Whelan no longer feared the fire. She'd already walked through it, and this time, she wouldn't walk alone. The morning they came, the wind held its breath. Dust curled behind the riders like a warning. 8 men on horseback, rifles gleaming, lawman's badge pinned cold against wool. Sheriff Whitcomb rode in front, face pale with purpose. Behind him, Reverend Barker's black coat fluttered like a vulture's wings. They reached the edge of the clearing by midday. Tasinan stood waiting. No blade, no bow, only his hands open by his sides, steady as the mountain behind him. Mary stood, beside him, not behind, beside. Whitcomb called out first. Step away from her, boy. You're a long way from where your kind belong. Tasinan didn't flinch. Reverend Barker raised a Bible. The Lord's mercy stretches far, Miss Whelan, but only if you repent. Come now. Leave this place. Leave him. You've been misled. Mary stepped forward. She held no weapon, no shield. Just the truth in her voice carried loud and clear. I didn't lose myself here, she said. I found who I was meant to be. The wind stirred the pine branches. Horses pawed the earth. You're defending a criminal, the sheriff growled. Then, so am I, she said, eyes burning. You locked me up for helping someone. You called it justice, but what he gave me was something you never could. She reached for Tasinan's hand. He took it, gently, firmly. Respect, peace, love. No bullet flew, no war broke loose. But something did break, a line in the earth, silent and final. Whitcomb glanced at Barker. The men behind them shuffled, uncertain. No one moved forward. The law had come, and found nothing they could take. That night, beneath a sky freckled with stars, Tasinan built a small fire. Mary laid 2 stones beside it, one for her sister, one for his brother. They didn't speak of loss. They let the flames carry it. She wore no white dress. He gave no ring. But when they stood beneath the tall pine and whispered words no one else would hear, it was more binding than any vow spoken in a church. A week later they finished the cabin. The horses came next. 2 Mustangs, rescued from a nearby gulch, skittish but strong. The ranch grew slow, honest, quiet, and months later when a child's cry echoed through the valley, the ridge stood witness. They named her Elsie, after Mary's sister. Sometimes the past tried to claw back in. A letter from a townsperson, a fire set in a far field, but the land healed what people could not. The wind carried their whispers away. And love, once silenced, now sang from every beam of wood, every hoofbeat on fresh dirt, every quiet moment shared by the fire. One night, as snow fell soft and slow again, Mary stood by the edge of the pasture. Tasinan came to her side and took her hand. No words, just the snow, the stars, and his hand, warm in hers. Some stories end in fire, others in silence. But the rarest kind, the truest kind, end in the place where 2 broken souls meet, and neither tries to fix the other. Only hold them steady until they bloom again. If this story stirred something in you, subscribe so you don't miss the next miracle tomorrow. Another love, another choice, another soul worth saving. Are you ready?